بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين ألف لام ميم
إلهي عظم البلاء وبرح الخفاء وانكشف الغطاء وانقطع الرجاء وضاقت الأرض ومنعت السماء وأنت المستعان وإليك المشتكى وعليك المعول في الشدة والرخاء اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد أولي الأمر الذين فرضت علينا طاعتهم وعرفتنا بذلك منزلتهم ففرج عنا بحقه فرجا عاجلا قريبا كلمح البصر أو هو أقرب يا محمد يا علي يا علي يا محمد اكفياني فإنكما كافيان وانصراني فإنكما ناصران يا مولانا يا صاحب الزمان الغوث 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 أدركني 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 الساعة 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 العجاب 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 يا أرحم الراحمين بحق محمد وآله الطاهرين.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والحمد حق كما يستحقه حمدا كثيرا ثم الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين الصادقين سيما بقية الله في الأراضين وحجته على الخلائق أجمعين إلى قيام يوم الدين. Respected viewers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The topic of Ashura is a topic that isn't only relevant amongst the Shia within the world, it's also a topic that comes up with many other sects within Islam, especially during the Muharram period. In saying so, many people within the Shia school of thought even question, how do we know exactly what took place on that day? How were things narrated? How do we understand that Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, along with family and companions, were slaughtered in the manner that they were slaughtered in? How was such thing able to happen? What happened during those times with regards to how battles were conducted and whatnot? These are some of the questions that arise when discussing the topic of Ashura. Today, we have with us our guest speaker, Sayyid Mahdi al-Mudarrisi. Sayyid, assalamu alaikum.
Alaykum assalam wa rahmatullah, habibi Hajj Ali.
We thank you for coming on the show today with us to discuss this topic that you're very well versed with and familiar with. Reason being why we've got the best of the best to discuss this Ashura topic. So we thank you very much for coming to discuss.
Thank you for having me. Jazakallah khair.
So, as I said, the Sayyid will discuss in light an intro of what the topic will be about today, and then inshallah we'll get straight into the questions. So please be patient with us. It will be a bit of a long discussion, but inshallah very worthy one. Sayyid, tfaddal.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajjil farajahum. The topic of Ashura and the events that transpired on that dreadful, horrific day is one that comes up year after year simply because of the sheer enormity and the gravity of the day of Ashura. And because it's commemorated every single year, it remains relevant. It's alive, it's present, it's something that we engage with on a very deep, visceral, emotional, and intellectual level. And so it's natural for people to ask questions because after all, it is an event that took place in antiquity. It's an event that took place in ancient history. So that will automatically provoke people's curiosity because they're trying to learn the facts, they're trying to ascertain the actual facts of the saga of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, and also because every once in a while you come across what you might call inconsistencies or contradictions. And so as a result, people who are curious would want to ask these questions just to get to the bottom of the matter and to know exactly what happened. Given the enormity of the day of Ashura and the colossal subject matter, which is Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam personifying truth and having a showdown with absolute evil, the event itself has been immortalized and crystallized in people's collective memories, and it'll never stop being the topic of conversation. And this is why it's something that we welcome, and we would love nothing more than to engage with it and to try and answer any questions that might come up, inshallah.
Ahsan, Sayyid. Sayyid, so with regards to the topic of Ashura, it is something that is very deep, very extensive. So we've chosen a select number of questions that we feel many people question. within this day and age. So inshallah we'll go through them. There's 10 questions in total. So the first question is, Ashura is known as the period within Muharram that the tragedy of Karbala befell upon Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam and family and companions. Why do we commemorate 10 days up until the Ashir, which is known as the 10th day? Is this what was done in historical times, or is this something that has kind of been brought in with this kind of day and age?
Well, the first thing we need to understand, and I think every Shia understands this, but perhaps from an outsider's perspective, it might strike people as odd that unlike most other religious traditions where they have one day that's commemorated or celebrated, we tend to take the entire 10 days, which is a minimum actually. In many communities around the world, the Shia commemorate the entire month, sometimes 2 months. And to answer that, I would have to say that the day of Ashura is an extremely important event. And I think you cannot underestimate the importance of it, the magnitude of what it means to us as followers of Imam al-Hussein, as people who connect with Imam al-Hussein. In fact, it's a day like no other, which is a statement that's been attributed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wa alihi, as well as other members of the Ahlul Bayt. La yawma ka yawm al-Hussein. And it's an event that requires one to be properly acclimated, right? In other words, you spend the first 9 days to set the tone and to prep yourself. It's like when you have a boxing match. You take a while to prep and to train, and you kind of put yourself in that zone. And so, other than all of the scriptural references that we can cite, and I'll mention one of them in particular, it's a matter of trying to acclimate yourself and prepare yourself so that you can maximize the benefits of the day of Ashura itself. And that is in addition to the fact that the lessons derived from the day of Ashura are too great to be summarized in just one day. That's why you take the first 9 days to do your best in terms of mentioning the stories, trying to draw lessons from them, and so forth. So the 9 days really is an absolute minimum, right? You could spend 900 days studying Ashura and learning about it and connecting with it, and it still wouldn't do justice to it. But I will mention one hadith as well, and we have multiple reports from the Imams of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam to answer the specific part of your question about whether or not this was something that was practiced back in those days as well. Yeah. So no, it's not something that was produced with time, but rather it's something that the Imams specifically instructed us to do. One hadith by Imam Rida alayhi salam says, Kana Abi, meaning he's speaking about his father Imam Musa ibn Ja'far alayhi salam. كان أبي إذا دخل شهر المحرم لا يرى ضاحكا. As soon as the month of Muharram began, my father would never be seen laughing again, meaning the first of Muharram, the first day of the Hijri calendar year. لا يرى ضاحكا وكانت الكآبة تغلب عليه. And sadness and depression would become very visible on the Imam. حتى تمضي 10 أيام, until the 10 days would lapse. فإذا كان يوم العاشر أو يوم العاشر, and when the 10th day of Muharram came, كان ذلك اليوم يوم مصيبته وحزنه وبكائه. That would be the climax of his emotional outpour. It's the day of his utmost sadness, and he would cry. He would be seen crying on that day. ويقول هو اليوم الذي قتل فيه الحسين. And if anybody asked him, he would say, this is the day Hussein was killed. So given all of these references that we have and teachings from the Imams of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, they've always wanted us to commemorate the full 10 days as an absolute minimum.
Ahsan Sayyid. Sayyid, how exactly did the stories that I mentioned today get documented? We imagine that if such a thing as the tragedy was to happen within this day and age, a journalist would be mixed up within the war, documenting everything that happens. How were things documented back then?
Very good question. In fact, this is a question that was the subject of a short course that I did. Because once again, when you come across stories that perhaps people, find them to be a little difficult to digest, or when you find some inconsistencies in the reporting, people tend to ask the question, well, who verified all of these events? Who recorded them? Who reported them? And so to answer that, I would have to start by saying, if you follow the journey of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, following the death of Muawiyah, when he was in Medina, and then upon his departure from Medina and going towards Mecca along with his entire family, and then while he was in Mecca, and then him leaving on the day of Arafah to go towards, or the day before Arafah to head towards Kufa. If you follow that journey, you'll notice that Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam was always a target for assassination. They wanted to kill him in Medina. They wanted to kill him in Mecca. In fact, he specifically says that the reason I'm leaving Mecca is because they're going to kill me if they find me here. Even if they find me holding to the drapes of the Kaaba. That's how vile Bani Umayyah were, and in particular Yazid. So they wanted to kill the Imam. What the Imam did was nothing short of incredible, because he maneuvered the political landscape in such a way to avoid a confrontation, whether it was in Medina, en route to Mecca, and in Mecca itself. And it's almost as though the Imam was carefully choosing the time and the place for the eventual and final showdown. And in doing so, the Imam ensured that there were as many witnesses as possible. He was going to get killed anyway. So you might as well try and carve the map in such a manner that it doesn't happen in some back alley in Mecca, that it doesn't happen in an ambush in Medina, right? Rather, you want this to be seen. You want this to make a splash, right? And that's what Imam al-Hussein did. Unbeknownst to Yazid and to his army, the Imam was taking charge of the situation. So, what that did was, in addition to the fact that the Imam gave sermons in Mecca, the Imam built the momentum so that people were now aware of the fact that he was dissenting, that he was not giving his pledge of allegiance to Yazid, that Yazid was a vile criminal, and so forth. The Imam was building that case while making sure that the event was as visible as possible, and boy was it visible, because when it happened, and it happened in broad daylight. It happened on the plains of a desert where everybody could see what was happening, and there were no less than 30,000 witnesses, at least on the enemy camp side. So to go back to your question earlier about who documented these events, and I explained this at great length in the course, essentially you have four primary sources for the events of Ashura. The first is the enemy combatants. 30,000 witnesses, they all saw it, they all participated, they were all there seeing what the Imam was doing, seeing what the Imam was saying, all of his sermons, every single one of his words and every single syllable was recorded. In addition to that, you had those reporters, right? In modern lingo, they say embeds, right? Yeah. The embedded reporters. So people like Humayd ibn Muslim or Hamid ibn Muslim, who is considered a very reliable reporter, and he's someone that people like Abu Mukhnaf and others and Tabari, they rely on him for his reports because, he was supposedly impartial. He was there just to record the events. He couldn't care about truth versus falsehood. Number three were the survivors from the camp of Imam al-Hussein. And you had at least three notable survivors. One of them, unfortunately, was the only person who abandoned Imam al-Hussein at the heat of battle. And his name is Ad-Dhahhak ibn Abdullah al-Mashriqi. And he's the one who reports that there were 72 companions with Imam al-Hussein, which is not an accurate number, right? But he's the one accredited with that number because he left the Imam before things got completely out of control. So Ad-Dhahhak al-Mashriqi was one. Uqba ibn Sam'an was a slave of Rubab. So he was also there. The reason he survived is because he was injured. And when they got to him, Umar ibn Sa'd said, well, he's just a slave, so we can spare killing him. They leave him, and he ends up becoming one of the important sources of the events of Ashura. And number 4 was a man by the name of Al-Muraqqa' ibn Thumana al-Asadi. He was also, Al-Murqa', depending on how you pronounce it. He was also a slave. I think his legs were cut off, but because of him being a slave, he wasn't killed. So they ended up exiling him to Oman, modern day Oman, but he also became an important source. Finally, and by far the most important source of information about the events of Ashura are the progeny of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. Lady Zainab salawatullahi alayha, Imam Zain al-Abidin alayhi salatu wassalam, Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, who was also present in Karbala, albeit at a very young age, and also the lineage of Imam al-Hussein, Imam al-Sadiq, and so on and so forth, who also became a very important source of information and very definitive source of information at that as well.
Ahsan Sayyid. Sayyid, there's so many versions and stories of what took place, and it is mentioned that the whole tragedy only lasted about 2 hours or so. How do we have so much information about a tragedy that didn't even last a day?
Well, I think the previous answer sheds a lot of light on how we end up with so much information. Let's not forget all the eyewitnesses, all of the survivors, the progeny, everybody who was there in Karbala. The fact that the event of Ashura was followed with multiple uprisings that were based on the calamity of Ashura. A lot of these uprisings carried the mantle of Imam al-Hussein and the oppression that the Imam and his family were subjected to as a reason to point out the illegitimacy of Yazid and Bani Umayyah, which meant that the event of Ashura was the central theme in all of this, right? You had a large group of people who defected from the army of Umar ibn Sa'd, who later became known as the Tawabin, right? Including Humayd ibn Muslim, the reporter that we mentioned earlier. He became one of the Tawabin. He experienced this turnaround, this incredible remorse for not supporting Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, despite the fact that he kept calling for help and reinforcements. And he ended up joining this band of people who fought against Bani Umayyah to sort of, in their way, to try to avenge the murder of Imam al-Hussein and to absolve themselves of the sins that they carried on their shoulders. Meaning that the tragedy of Imam al-Hussein remained a very vibrant, lively, relevant. It was a fire that was never extinguished, right? Because of that, books were compiled very early on, right? And again, I go into detail about that in the course. You have some of the companions of Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam who ended up writing a maqtal, meaning a historical narrative of what happened on the day of Ashura, like Al-Asbagh ibn Nubata, like some of the companions of Imam al-Baqir, Imam al-Sadiq later on, like Abu Lut ibn Abi Mukhnaf, for example. All of these people had to write about this event because it wasn't some, it wasn't some drive-by shooting where you have some innocent bystander who gets killed by accident. This was a very well orchestrated and executed massacre in broad daylight in the middle of the desert with so many eyewitnesses. So it's not something that was going to be forgotten, right? And then, of course, you have the role of Sayyidah Zainab and Imam Zain al-Abidin and the Imams of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, one after the other. Imam al-Ridha then revived the tragedy of Imam al-Hussein, which is why when we recite his ziyarah, may Allah grant us his ziyarah very soon, inshallah, together. The Imam is referred to in his ziyarah al-Jawadain, if I'm not mistaken. As-salamu ala al-Imam al-Ra'uf alladhi As-salamu ala al-Imam al-Ra'uf alladhi I'm paraphrasing here, Ahya Yawm al-Tufuf. He was the one who revived the tragedy of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein, his grandfather. The point is, you had hundreds of books compiled about this, eyewitness reports brought together in the form of those books, that many of which survive to this day, or at least part of those books have survived to this day.
Ahsan Sayyid. So this is a very interesting question, because you actually, I myself have heard a lot of people from other sects say that when the Shia scholars get up on the minbar, they're actually trained apparently to make people cry. So with saying so, is everything that's mentioned on the pulpit regarding the tragedy of Karbala authentic? Is it permissible for the speaker to go beyond non-authentic means just to put the people in a mindset based on what's being discussed at that time?
Again, a very good question that I discuss at length in the course. But what I will say is this. You mentioned earlier that the events of Ashura took place in a very short span of time, right? I wouldn't say 2 hours, because the companions of Imam al-Hussein tried their best to drag it on as much as possible, because their aim and their intention, they were laser focused on trying to save Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. That was their mission. And so each one of them was able to counter hundreds and even thousands of enemy combatants. And, I think realistically we could say that they dragged it on for about half a day, right? So since Salat al-Dhuhr until about, or actually before Salat al-Dhuhr until around Maghrib time. So the fact of the matter is that you cannot encapsulate all the events, all the perspectives, all the emotions in a lecture. You can't do that. Because think of Ali al-Akbar salamullahi alayhi, for example, heading towards the battlefield. You could write volumes about the feelings experienced and the sentiments experienced by Lady Zainab alayhi salam. You could write volumes about what was going through the mind of his younger sister, Sakina. You could write volumes about, every single one of these individuals and how they felt and what they experienced. So you can never really encapsulate all of that in any way. What you can do, however, is try and describe those sentiments and feelings and emotions as best as you can, which is what a poet does, right? There's a reason why the Imams of the Ahlul Bayt, may God's peace and blessings be upon them, encouraged poets to write verses of poetry about Imam Hussein, because poetry gives you that so-called poetic license, right? It gives you the ability, and poets in particular have this distinct brilliance when it comes to describing things that you've never seen, but because of the description that they provide, you feel part and parcel of that event, right? So, can you get up on the minbar, on the pulpit, and just make up stories? Absolutely not. What you can do, though, is zoom in on those events that we know happened definitively. Ali al-Akbar was killed on the day of Ashura. There's no question there. Ali al-Asghar, or Abdullah al-Radi', the 6-month-old infant of Imam al-Hussein, was killed. Now, was he 6 months old, or was he a year old? Or maybe he was a day old, because some reports say that he was born on the day of Ashura. And I would say those details don't really matter. It's not that they don't matter, of course they matter, but they don't matter insofar as reporting them on the minbar. And this means that if you happen to bring out a young baby, a newborn, into the majlis where the tragedy of Imam al-Hussein is being commemorated, and he's wearing a green headband, or it could be a she. What if it's a little girl? Can you bring her out to symbolize Ali al-Asghar alayhi salam, so that people connect with Imam al-Hussein and his tragedy? Of course you can. Are you saying that this newborn infant child represents exactly what Ali al-Asghar was? Of course not. Are you saying that he was a girl, not a boy? Of course not. That's not the point. The point is that in many cases, especially when it comes to the poetry that's recited, whether it be in Arabic, in Urdu, in Farsi, in English nowadays, especially with the poetry, especially with some of the emotive language that's used, it's not intended as a historically accurate report. Nobody expects that. There is this unspoken rule and agreement between the speaker and the listener that what I'm getting here isn't the exact events as they transpired on the day of Ashura. What it is, however, is a means of connecting me back to the tragedy. And that is required. That is a very big part of the narrative. We're trying to make people connect with Imam al-Hussein. That's the whole point of the commemoration of Imam al-Hussein, is to make people connect with him on an emotional level so that they would shed tears, so that they would cry, so that they could then learn from Imam al-Hussein and make him an inspiration for them morally in their lives. Right? That's a big part of it. The Prophet cried for Imam al-Hussein on the day he was born. The Prophet cried many, many times every time Jibreel told him that your grandson here will be massacred at the hand of people who claim to be Muslims. Right? Fatima az-Zahra cried, Imam Ali cried. Crying is a big part of this. So, the use of emotive tools, whether it be language, whether it be lighting, whether it be sound effects, whether any of these things, plays, theatrical performances, all of these things are very, very important. But are they trying to communicate to us exactly what happened? No, and they'll never be able to do that. They won't be able to do it. No poetry is going to be able to do it. Nothing will make that happen. Why? Because the tragedy of Imam al-Hussein was too big to be encapsulated in any human language.
Ahsan Sayyid, perfectly said. Battles back then were different to battles now, beyond the technological advances and whatnot. How were battles conducted? What were some of the rules that the defenders and attackers mutually agreed upon?
So the Arabs had their own, if you like, laws of rules of engagement, as they say, right? For example, almost every battle would begin with one-on-one duels where someone who's extremely brave and a skilled warrior would come out into the field, and then his counterpart would come out from the other side, and they would engage before then perhaps the armies fighting each other. So these were rules that were practiced, perhaps since time immemorial, since the time of the Jahiliyyah. One thing we need to remember, though, is that the army of Bani Umayyah, the army of the Khilafah, on the day of Ashura, threw out all of these rules and decided that there were no holds barred. The reason they did that, in fact, we have specific indications that when the companions of Imam al-Hussein came out and tried to challenge their counterparts to fight them, they ended up killing every single person that dared challenge them. There's a hadith by Imam al-Baqir alayhi salatu wasalam, which I'd like to draw your audience's attention to, in which the Imam says that when the companions of Imam al-Hussein were killed, ما أحسوا بحر الحديد, they couldn't feel the heat of the blades, meaning they were almost numb to the pain. Now, why would that happen? It happens at times of extreme euphoria, when the adrenaline is pumping through your blood, when your singular focus is on defending Imam al-Hussein at any cost. When you're the kind of person who comes out and says, Ya Aba Abdullah, Wallah law akalatni as-siba'u hayyan, if the lions, if the beasts of the desert eat me alive, I would never let go of you. When you have people who come to the Imam and say, if I am killed, then burnt, then my ashes were dispersed in the air, then I was brought back to life and had that done to me 1,000 times, I would still not abandon you. That kind of spirit, that kind of devotion and commitment to the cause of defending Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam means that you are now the equivalent of 1,000 fighters. So I don't care who you're going to bring before Habib ibn Mudahir. He's dead. We know that for a fact. He's gone. So Umar ibn Sa'd, at some point, it clicked. The penny dropped. And he realized that this was no ordinary army. This was no ordinary camp of travelers traversing through the desert trying to get to some destination in Kufa. That this was backed with divine power. Like when Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam plucked open the gates of Khaybar. When somebody asked him, how did you do that? He said to him that I plucked it with بِقُوَّةٍ رَبَّانِيَّةٍ. This was divine power. I was given divine power by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The angels came to my aid. So these people, you know, they were going to wipe out the entire 30,000 army of minions that Yazid had sent just by challenging them on a one-to-one basis. So they decided that no holds were barred, that they should break all those rules. One of the rules that they broke was to prevent the Imam's camp from drinking water. I mean, imagine you do that. 3 days of not drinking a single drop of water. It's going to wear you down. And yet despite that, look at what they did. And eventually they played so dirty. By, for example, at one point, I'm sure you've heard this, where the Imam got to the water. And it was the moment when he says to his horse, Dhul Janah, he says to him, you're thirsty and I'm thirsty. Go ahead and drink before me. Allahu Akbar. Sallallahu alayhi ya Aba Abdullah. So then the horse backs away. The Imam then sticks his blessed hand into the water. He's about to drink when somebody lies to him and says to him, how could you enjoy the cool stream when your family is being attacked? I mean, these people, they weren't going to play by the rules. They were there to try and express as much cruelty and savagery as possible. So there were rules, they just never followed them.
Ahsan Sayyid.
Ahsanallah alayk.
So Sayyid, we are unfortunately running short on time. I think we've got about 10 minutes to go.
Keep these answers short, inshallah.
So inshallah, if we can keep them short, there's 4 left, 2 minutes a question.
Sure, no problem.
Are there things that we currently know about that took place on the day that are questionable amongst our scholars nowadays? If so, such as what?
Scholars can differ on details, and they do differ on details all the time. You know that, right? When it comes to matters of fiqh, when they actually have the evidence right there, they just see it from different perspectives. So when it comes to historical matters and the verification process and all that, obviously there's going to be differences of opinion. But are there events that are categorically denied by most scholars? There are a few, not too many, a few. One of them is the story of Al-Qasim ibn al-Hasan alayhi salam getting married on the day of Ashura, right? That's not a historically accurate or authentic event. Having said that, people do commemorate, when they commemorate Al-Qasim ibn al-Hasan, they also hold like this, you know, wedding type of ceremony, and that's okay. They're not trying to say this actually happened on the day of Ashura. Rather, it's a reference to the fact that he was so young, that he had his whole life ahead of him, and yet he was killed by these vile creatures. So that's about it, really. I mean, some of the finer details maybe, but again, if you keep in mind the fact that most of these stories are trying to connect you back to Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam and not trying to depict the event verbatim and exactly as they happened, there's not a whole lot we can mention.
Ahsan Sayyid. What are we expected to gain from Ashura?
Ashura is our life, and Ashura is our salvation. There's a hadith actually which comes to mind now where the Holy Prophet ﷺ speaks about Imam al-Hussein, and he says, بِالْحُسَيْنِ تَسْعُدُونَ وَبِالْحُسَيْنِ تَشْقُونَ. It is through Hussein that you can find happiness and salvation, and it's through Hussein that you can also find your deprivation and your loss. Which means that if you make Imam al-Hussein your true north, if Imam al-Hussein is your moral compass, if Imam al-Hussein is the person with whom you keep verifying every single one of your daily actions, you're going to find salvation. What are we expected to learn? to learn about Islam, to know what Islam is all about, to know what the Quran means. You have to recognize Abu Abdullah al-Hussein as the inheritor of the knowledge of the Quran, as the interpreter of the verses of the Quran, and as the one who applied every teaching in the Quran in one day, the day of Ashura.
Ahsan Sayyid. That was very nicely said in a short period. Where are the 72 companions, as we mentioned before, based off of that narration, even though it may not be fully correct, but the ones that fought with the Imam alayhi salam, where are they buried and who buried them?
So the companions of Imam Hussein, who, as I said, in Ziyaratul Nahiya, the second Ziyaratul Nahiya, attributed to the 12th Imam Ajjalallahu Ta'ala Farajahu Sharif, the Imam mentions about 100 companions, right? There were people who were killed after Imam al-Hussein was killed. So that's why you have this discrepancy in the numbers. This 72 is like the absolute minimum. Where were they buried? They were buried at the location where, if you've been to Karbala, you know there is a shrine dedicated to them, right? And it's usually on the right side when you're approaching from the Qibla gate to the shrine of Imam al-Hussein. There's a big shrine and they're all buried there. Who buried them? So what happened was, on the 10th of Muharram, the battle ended. On the 11th of Muharram, they left. Umar ibn Sa'd took all his army, his troops, as well as the captives, took them to Kufa. And the reason for that was because he waited until all of his dead were buried. Whereas he left all of the bodies of Imam al-Hussein and the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam on the plains of Karbala, even after they were ransacked and looted and everything. So what happened was that immediately after that, when they left and there was no one to sort of kill any person who tried to come and help out, the women of Bani Asad came. And after the women of Bani Asad, the men were then encouraged to come, because everybody was afraid, right? But it was the women who led the charge and the campaign. So they all came, the men of Bani Asad came, and they were about to, on the 13th of Muharram, they were about to actually start to bury the bodies. And that's when Imam Zain al-Abidin alayhi salam came back. And we have lots of discussions that we can make about that, but in the interest of time, I will say that the Imam came back miraculously, obviously, because he was also in shackles. He was one of the captives, but he returned to Karbala and he said, only I get to bury Imam al-Hussein, because an infallible can only be buried by another infallible. So the Imam came and then he gave them specific instructions as to where everybody has to be buried. The companions are buried here. Habib ibn al-Zahir has his own grave, his own burial site, to highlight his significance. Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas gets buried at that location. His two hands get buried here. And it's really interesting. I remember about maybe 15 years ago, someone who studied this whole process came and visited us in the holy city of Karbala, and he had drawn all the locations of the bodies and the severed limbs and whatnot and where they were born, and he said that it actually spells the word Al-Hussein in Arabic.
Wow.
So it was very strategic, and the Imam chose exactly where everything goes for a reason.
Ahsan Sayyid. Sayyid, final two questions. I think we got about 2 minutes, 3 minutes. 3 minutes. Final two questions. Is it true that the real Turba Husseiniyyah, so not necessarily the ones that we all pray on, because most of that is from Iran or just Iraq in general, does it turn into blood wherever it is? Because this is spoken about a lot, that it's a hoax and whatnot.
Well, whether or not people want to believe this, let me take you back to the actual day of Ashura, because we have both Sunni reports as well as non-Muslim reports that speak of really strange things happening as a direct result of the massacre of the day of Ashura. تاريخ دمشق لابن عساكر, who's a Sunni historian. الصواعق المحرقة لابن حجر, who's a Sunni scholar as well. الخصائص الكبرى للسيوطي, as well as ينابيع المودة للقندوزي. All of these Sunni sources report that the day of Ashura, the sky rained blood. I mean, what's stranger, the sky raining blood or the color of the clay being discolored, right? Plus, in addition to that, you have the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is a very, very famous and antiquated history and annal of Anglo-Saxon history, which actually dates back to the 9th century, and there are still, to this day, we have the original copies of, or at least some pages of this chronicle, which says, under the heading of 685 to 690, he says, this was the year where it rained blood in England, and all milk and butter turned into fresh blood. So we have traditions from the Imams of the Ahlul Bayt, in addition to all that, history, that the day of Ashura, the sky rained blood, that they would lift up rocks and they could see fresh blood underneath it. So yes, we do have traditions that the actual soil around the burial site of Imam al-Hussein, the grave of Imam al-Hussein, does change color or turn into blood on the day of Ashura.
Ahsan Sayyid. So Sayyid, final question. What is Ziyarat Ashura and who wrote it?
Ziyarat Ashura is one of our most authentic texts that speak about Imam al-Hussein, and it's a visitation essentially. Who wrote it? Well, it's been reported by our most senior scholars, dating all the way back to Ibn Quluwayh, the teacher of Shaykh al-Mufid, as well as Shaykh al-Mufid, as well as Shaykh al-Tusi, Shaykh al-Ta'ifa, as well as Sayyid ibn Tawus. And I mean, these are giants, right? If you know anything about the Shia scholarship, then you recognize these names. They reported this ziyarah, which means in terms of authenticity, there's no question there. Who wrote it? Well, they attribute the ziyarah through an authentic chain of narrators back to Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, who himself takes the chain of narrators through his forefathers all the way to the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who quotes Jibreel, who quotes God himself, which means that Ziyarat Ashura is technically considered hadithun qudsi. It's the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being taught to the archangel, to the Prophet, to the Imams, and to you and I, so that we could connect with Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam.
Ahsan Sayyid.
Ahsanallah alayk, barakallah fiqh.
Viewers, that's the episode for today. Inshallah, within the short time that we had you with us, you were able to benefit from the knowledge that the Sayyid has provided us. Sayyid, we thank you for taking the time to research into these technical questions. And viewers, inshallah, like I said, we were able to benefit from such information. For now, that's us. See you next week. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaykum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Barakallah.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. أشهد أن عليًا ولي الله. أشهد أن عليا ولي الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. حي على خير العمل. حي على خير العمل. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله. لا إله إلا الله. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله وسلم.